The earth trembles, but this is no earthquake. It is the mighty roar of 100,000 Persians advancing on the last stand of the Greeks. 100,000-strong army of cavalry and infantry, sent by a god-king to wipe this land from the face of the earth. Against them, a mere 10,000 Spartans, a thin red line. The rest of the Greek army has fled in disarray for hundreds of miles around. This is not a battle, it is suicide. The nightmare of Thermopylae is repeating itself on an open plain. This time, there are no narrow passes, no rock walls to cover their flanks. This is a waterlogged plain, and the Persian commander, Mardonius, knows this. He is about to avenge his king's only naval defeat, reveling in the impending destruction of Sparta. How did it come to this? How is it that a year after 300 men shook the greatest empire on earth, the fate of the West again rests in the hands of a handful of Spartans? To understand this impending slaughter, we must go back to the smell of ash. 1 year ago, 1 year since the known world stood still. 1 year since 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, were annihilated in a narrow mountain pass, named Thermopylae, in a suicidal defense. 300 against an army so vast, it was said its arrows blotted out the sun. A glorious defeat, yes, but a defeat nonetheless. The Persian king Xerxes did not stop. He marched south and burned Athens to the ground, the Acropolis, the pride of Greece, reduced to ash and ruin. Greece was broken, brought to its knees, and then the question echoed through every city, every frightened home. What was the point of Leonidas's sacrifice? What was the point of the blood of 300 if the result was total annihilation? We think we know this story. We've been told the legend of the 300 1,000 times, but it is not the whole story. It is merely the prologue, a prologue to a much darker, much more suspenseful thriller. The real story is not about how 300 died. It's about how 10,000 Spartans avenged their deaths, and in doing so, saved the Western world. But this revenge, this moment of brutal retribution, almost didn't happen, because Sparta, the most formidable war machine in Greece, hesitated. While Athens burned, the Spartans built a wall, quite literally, a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth. They were sealing themselves into their Peloponnesian peninsula, debating if saving the rest of Greece was worth the blood of their own sons. The logic was cold. Let the Persians drown trying to cross the sea to reach them. The man holding the fate of civilization in his hands was not a heroic king like Leonidas. He was a regent, a man living in the shadow of a ghost. His name was Pausanias, nephew of Leonidas, the commander-in-chief of the Spartan army. And he was paralyzed. He had to go north. He had to risk every Spartan citizen, his entire army in an open field battle against an enemy that outnumbered them 3, perhaps 5 to 1. Or should he secure Sparta and let the rest of the world burn? On the other side of the board was the Persian commander Mardonius. Cunning, arrogant, ruthless, Xerxes had returned to Persia, but he left Mardonius with 300,000 elite warriors and one simple order: crush Greek resistance. And Mardonius didn't just use brute force. He played a deadly game of manipulation. He saw the division, he saw the Spartan doubt, and he sent envoys not to Sparta, but to the ruins of Athens. The deal he offered was enticing. "Abandon these cowardly Spartans," he said. "Join me. I will spare your lives. I will rebuild your city with Persian gold. You will be my most valued allies." Imagine the position of the Athenians. Their city a pile of smoking stones, their families refugees on an island, their Spartan allies hiding behind a wall. The temptation to agree, to survive, was enormous. What would they do? Would they trust the Spartans, who had clearly abandoned them in their darkest hour? The Athenian answer changed the course of history. They sent a message not to Mardonius. They sent an ultimatum to Sparta, and the message was clear. If you do not march north now, if you do not come and face the Persians with us, then we will accept Mardonius's offer, not out of betrayal, but out of pure survival. And when we do, our ships and our armies will join his, and together we will come to Sparta and erase it from the map. Suddenly, Pausanias was faced not just with a foreign invasion, he was faced with total civil war. The time for politics, for doubt, for half measures was over. Legend has it, a desperate and enraged Athenian delegate stood before Pausanias and the Spartan elders. "The wall you are building," he screamed, "is it to protect you from the Persians or to hide from shame? Leonidas died so you could live as cowards. That night, the decision was made, but Sparta does not move like other cities. There were no public pronouncements, no heroic speeches. It was done in secret. While the Athenian envoys slept, disappointed by the lack of response, Pausanias was already acting. Orders were given. The Phocos, Spartiatai, the Pletius, the elite citizen warriors, the Fusan Perioikoi, the Lacedaemonian allies, and, by some accounts, over 30,000 helots, armed serfs, marched to war. The largest army Sparta had ever assembled moved in complete silence under the cover of night. The next morning, as the Athenians came to make their final plea before surrendering to Persia, the Spartan magistrate finally revealed the truth. "Our men," he calmly said, "are already on the march. In fact, they are probably miles away by now, marching to meet Mardonius." The game had changed. The deadliest war machine of the ancient world had been set in motion, and now nothing could stop it. 10,000 Spartan hoplites, the steel core of the unified Greek army, marched towards the plain near the small town of Plataea. They marched not just to save Athens, they marched to avenge Leonidas. Mardonius learned of the Spartan march and, against all expectations, he smiled. The game of diplomacy was over. Now came the game he knew best. Total war. His plan to divide the Greeks had failed, but his plan to destroy them was about to begin. He did not flee. He did not retreat. Instead, he advanced. He chose his ground with surgical precision. He knew the Spartans were masters of close combat, unbeatable in the hills and narrow passes, so he chose the opposite. He chose the wide-open plain of Plataea in Boeotia, the perfect battlefield for his main advantage, cavalry. And he laid his trap. He built a massive wooden fortification, a fortified camp on the banks of the river Oenophyta, a place from where his archers and horsemen could operate with impunity. Then he deployed his army. 300,000 souls. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, and even Greeks. Greeks from the satrapies who had sided with the invaders, convinced of Persia's inevitable victory. When Pausanias arrived, his heart must have sunk. Across the river lay a sea of tents, an ocean of men, outnumbering his army 3-1. His 10,000 Spartans were the steel backbone, but the total Greek army, including Athenians, Corinthians, and others, barely reached 100,000 men, and they were in the worst possible position. Pausanias immediately understood the trap. If he ordered his hoplites across the river to attack, the Persian cavalry would tear them apart, horses trampling their ranks, mounted archers picking them off from afar. It would be a slaughter. Thermopylae, multiplied by 100. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. He ordered his men to make camp on the slopes of the hills bordering the plain, just out of reach of the cavalry, and so began the most tense standoff of antiquity. This was not a battle. It was a war of nerves. Two massive armies, miles apart, staring each other down. Each morning the sun rose over two camps, and neither moved. Day 1, Day 2, Day 5, weeks. The tension was unbearable. The Greek soldiers, ripped from their farms, saw their supplies dwindle. The heat was suffocating. The stench of 100,000 men camped in one place was overwhelming, and each day, across the river, they saw the Persian cavalry. Mardonius didn't wait. He provoked. He sent his elite cavalry under the command of a man named Mestius, a legendary commander, a giant on a Nicaean stallion with golden harnesses. His mission was not to win a battle, but to break Greek morale. Day after day, Mestius and his riders galloped to the edge of the Greek positions, firing arrows, hurling insults, calling the Spartans cowards. "Here they are," they'd shout with laughter, "the brave Spartans hiding in the hills like frightened goats. Where is your dead king now?" Pausanias gritted his teeth and ordered his men to hold their positions. He knew one careless move, one unit of hoplites breaking formation to chase the riders, would be annihilated. But Mardonius's provocations were not enough. He craved blood. On the 8th day of the standoff, he ordered Mestius to attack in earnest. The Persian cavalry attacked not the entrenched Spartans on the heights, but the Athenians, who occupied a lower, more vulnerable position. The attack was brutal. Thousands of horsemen charged into the Athenian ranks. The Greeks formed their shield wall, but the horses crashed into them. The riders hurled javelins from above. Archers unleashed volleys of arrows. The Athenians were impaled, unable to strike back. They were on the verge of breaking. If this line fell, the entire Greek army would collapse. Pausanias knew this. The Spartans knew this. The revenge for Leonidas was about to die in a cavalry skirmish. Before the real battle had even begun, panic spread through the Athenian line. Men fell. Shields shattered. They could not hold formation. They sent a desperate messenger to Pausanias, a runner who weaved between horses and arrows. "We are broken," he cried. "If you do not send help, we will perish. The line will not hold." Pausanias, from his elevated position, watched the unfolding disaster. He turned to his Spartans. They were ready for battle, itching for a fight, but he could not move his main force. Otherwise, the entire plain would fall under Mardonius's control. In that moment of utter despair, when revenge had died before it was born, a small contingent of Megarian hoplites, seeing the Athenian retreat, made a suicidal decision. Just 300 men, they charged down the hill into the chaos. It was not an organized assault. It was a desperate dash to certain death with battle cries. The Persian cavalry, caught by surprise by this flanking attack, wheeled to meet them, and then a miracle happened. A stray arrow, fired from either the Megarian or Athenian ranks, found its mark. Mestius's magnificent warhorse, rearing in agony, threw the Persian giant to the ground. Suddenly, the god of war was in the mud. His scaled golden armor made him almost impervious to spears, but also incredibly heavy. Before he could rise, the Greek hoplites surrounded him. What followed was not a battle. It was madness. The Greeks piled in, striking at the gaps in his armor, beating at his helmet. Finally, an Athenian soldier, seeing they couldn't penetrate his breastplate, thrust his spear into the visor of his helmet, directly into his eye. The great Mestius, the terror of the Persian cavalry, was dead. When the Persians saw their leader fall, fury overcame discipline. They ceased to be an army and became a mob, desperate not to attack the Greeks, but to retrieve their commander's body. And so, around the corpse of one man, a fierce battle erupted. A whirlwind of daggers, swords, and shields. Men stabbed each other in the face, in the gut, fighting with bare hands over a piece of golden armor. The Greeks pushed forward. The Persians retreated, the body being dragged back and forth across the bloodied mud. Finally, the heavier, better-armed hoplites secured the corpse. They formed a shield wall around it and slowly began to retreat up the hill, carrying their trophy. The Persian cavalry, defeated, decapitated, and humiliated, withdrew. That night, the Greek army celebrated. They stripped the armor from Mestius's body. He was a man of imposing stature and beauty. They placed his body on a cart and slowly paraded it before all the Greek ranks. The men cheered, banging their spears and shields. It was the first victory, small, but with a massive psychological impact. They had killed one of Mardonius's top commanders, weathered the cavalry charge, and they had proof. In the Persian camp, the mood was the opposite. Mardonius was furious. He had lost his best cavalry commander through sheer arrogance. It is said that the cries and wails over Mestius's death could be heard across the entire Plataean plain. The stalemate was broken, but not in Mardonius's favor. The Persian commander realized that provocations would not work. The Greeks would not leave their hills voluntarily. He would have to force them down. If he could not defeat them by force, he would defeat them by hunger and thirst. His strategy changed. The war of nerves turned into a siege. He ordered his riders to stop attacking the front lines. Instead, he sent them out on wide, sweeping rides, day and night, to surround the hills. Their target was the Greek army's throat, its supply lines. Hundreds of wagons, laden with grain and wine from the Peloponnese, were intercepted and burned. Convoys were destroyed. The Greek soldiers on the hills began to feel the first pangs of hunger, but Mardonius had an even more crucial target. The only source of fresh water for the 100,000-strong Greek army was not the Persian-controlled Oenophyta River. It was a single spring in the mountains, the spring of Gargia, a small oasis sustaining an entire army. And now, the entire Persian cavalry knew where it was. Mardonius gave the order. No more attacks, no more skirmishes. Poison the water, he commanded. Destroy the spring. The torment began. Mounted archers rode to the spring, firing arrows at any soldier attempting to fill a water skin. Each trip for water became a suicidal mission. The Greeks had to send armed contingents of hoplites to protect the water carriers. The Greek army was dying of thirst within sight of the river. Morale, so high after the death of Mestius, plummeted. The men were hungry, thirsty, and the stench of their own camp became unbearable. Pausanias was caught in a deadly trap. He knew he could not stay, but he could not attack either. And now, thanks to Mardonius, he could not retreat. He was stuck in his mountain fortress. Time was running out. Thirst and hunger would kill his army before the Persians had to lift a single sword. The revenge for Thermopylae was about to drown in a murky spring. Night descended on the dying army. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Thirst cracked their lips. The Greek commanders gathered in Pausanias' tent. The torchlight flickered, casting shadows on gaunt, despairing faces. The smell of defeat was palpable. Pausanias, regent of Sparta, the man carrying the burden of Leonidas's revenge, had to make the most humiliating decision of his life. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice hoarse, "and we cannot attack. We will retreat. Retreat. For a Spartan." The word was poison, a symbol of defeat and cowardice. A spit in the face of 300 heroes who had chosen death over retreat. The plan conceived was a desperate yet nightmarish military operation. Moving over 100,000 men in pitch darkness over rough terrain, with enemy cavalry only miles away. The objective was a section called the Island, a patch of land near Plataea, protected by 2 rivers, where there was water, and the chance to regroup if they survived the night. Orders were given in whispers. At midnight, the army was to move, but then chaos erupted. This army was not a single entity. It was a coalition of warring city-states, united only by fear, and in the dark, this coalition fractured. The center of the formation, the Corinthians and the Nagarenes, obeyed. Terrified of the cavalry, they grabbed their gear and fled towards Plataea, too hastily, not waiting for anyone, and vanished into the night. On the left flank, the Athenians, always suspicious of the Spartans, refused to move until they were sure the Spartans had also begun to retreat. They stood their ground, waiting for the plan to collapse. However, the real drama unfolded on the right flank, in the very heart of the Spartan camp. A Spartan captain named Amaphiritus stood before Pausanias. His face was a mask of rage and shame. He refused to move. "Spartan law forbids retreat," he roared. "Leonidas died. We stay and die. We do not run like dogs." Pausanias was enraged. A mutiny in the darkest hour. He tried to reason with him. "This is not a retreat. It is a tactical maneuver. We will all die here if we do not move." Amathus simply picked up a large rock and threw it at Pausanias' feet. "This is my vote," he said. "I vote to stay here and fight." Time was running out. Dawn was approaching. Pausanias was trapped. He could not abandon the Spartan contingent to a mass slaughter, but neither could he stay and condemn the entire army to death by thirst. Pausanias' patience snapped. "Let him stay," he commanded the rest of the army. "We march. If he has honor, he will follow us." And so, the mighty Spartan phalanx, the main force of Greece, began to retreat, leaving their own captain and his men alone against 300,000 enemies. On the 12th day, dawn broke over the Plataean plain. Mardonius' scouts looked towards the hills where the Greek army had camped for nearly 2 weeks, and saw nothing. The hills were empty. The Greek camp had vanished. The news spread like wildfire to Mardonius' tent. The Persian commander emerged, squinting at the rising sun. And then, in the distance, he saw the chaos. He did not see a unified army. He saw scattered groups of men in disarray. He saw the Athenians on his left flank, moving erratically towards the hills. He saw the Spartans in the center, slowly retreating across the plain, trying to reach the foothills. Mardonius laughed. "Cowards," he roared. "Look at them. The Spartans are running." He saw the contingent of Amaphiritus, who had finally decided to move and was running to catch up with the main army. He saw confusion, not tactical maneuvering. He saw a desperate flight, arrogance. The fatal mistake that had killed Mystius had now infected the commander-in-chief himself. He turned to his generals. "They have been starving for days. They are thirsty, and now they are running. We do not need a strategy. Just catch them." He leaped onto his white warhorse, drew his yatahan. "Attack?" he bellowed at the top of his lungs. "No mercy. Today is Greece's last day." The 10,000 immortals, the king's personal guard, were the first to charge. Behind them, the Persian cavalry, and behind them, the roar of 300,000 men, smelling blood, a vast human wave pouring across the Oenophyta River, straight at the fleeing Spartans. Mardonius's trap had failed, but Pausanias's botched retreat had delivered victory on a silver platter. The earth trembled. This was no metaphor. It was 100,000 feet and tens of thousands of hooves pounding the ground in unison. Pausanias turned, and his blood ran cold. The retreat was over. The plain across the river was alive. Mardonius's army was not advancing. It was spilling across the land like a black tide, letting out a deafening war cry, heading straight for them. First, the cavalry, the nightmare of every hoplite. The Persian horsemen crossed the river without hesitation and thundered forward. They did not attempt a frontal assault on the phalanx. There was no phalanx, only a swarm of fleeing men. "Form up," Pausanias screamed. "Hold the line." The Spartans, disciplined even on the verge of annihilation, tried to turn and present their shields, but it was too late. The first wave was not spears, it was arrows, thousands, tens of thousands. The Persian mounted archers galloped in perfect circles around the Spartan formation, unleashing black clouds of death. Men screamed, falling with arrows in their throats and unprotected legs between the plates of armor. This was a distant slaughter. The Spartans could do nothing. They were being decimated, bled dry, destroyed in the open, exactly as Mardonius had planned. And then came the infantry. The warriors of the Persian elite immortal guard marched with terrifying self-assurance. Within bowshot, they let loose their arrows. The sky darkened. The Spartan regent Pausanias desperately sought help. "Where are the Athenians, sir?" a scout shouted. "The Athenians are engaged," he was told. "The Thebans have intercepted them." The Greek army had split in two. The betrayal of the Thebans, fighting for Persia, had worked. The Athenians were locked in their own bloody fight on the left flank, completely isolated. No one rushed to the Spartans' aid. They were alone. The Persian infantry approached. First, 100 meters away, then 50. They were close. The Spartans could already make out the whites of their eyes, but they did not move. Under a hail of arrows amid the chaos and screams, Pausanias ordered his men to stand. Men were falling dead around him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the army priest. "The sacrifice," Pausanias yelled. Spartan law was now absolute. No battle without favorable omens. The trembling priest slit the throat of a sheep on the bloodied ground. Men were falling dead all over him as he read the animal's entrails. Pausanias grabbed him. "Well?" The priest looked up. His eyes were wide with terror. Unfavorable. An arrow struck Pausanias' shield with such force it nearly broke his arm. "Bring another," he roared. The priest sacrificed another animal. The Persians were 30 meters away. They were no longer shooting arrows. They had prepared their short spears. "Unfavorable." The priest cried again. The Spartan captains looked at Pausanias. Their men were dying without striking a single blow. Discipline was turning into suicide. The revenge for Leonidas was fading into ritual and blood and dirt. The first line of the Persian elite guard, the Immortals, crashed into the Spartan shields. The battle had begun, and the Spartans had not even been given permission to fight. They could only defend. Pausanias, in a wagon of despair, no longer looked at the priest. He turned, raised his arms to the heavens, to where he believed the temple of Hera stood, and cried out, "Gods, do not abandon us now. Do not let Greece perish here." At that exact moment, the first Persian line began to push. The priest, after his third sacrifice, cried out, "The omens are favorable." Pausanias was struck as if by lightning. The regent lowered his arms. His face was no longer that of a politician or a general. It was the mask of pure rage. He turned to his men, who were waiting for orders, even as they died. "Sparta!" The cry was not an order, it was an explosion. The Spartan phalanx, the most perfect killing machine ever devised, finally sprung into action. They lowered their spears, and the shield wall that had retreated and defended, suddenly, as one organism, moved forward. The cry was the expression of a year's humiliation, the suppressed fury of shame for a dead king in a mountain pass. All that poison, all that Spartan discipline, directed into a single movement. The advance was not a chaotic attack. It was something far more terrifying. It was the movement of a glacier of bronze and steel. Shields locked together. 10,000 Spartans took one step, then another. The Persian elite immortals of the empire, halted at Thermopylae only by terrain, now met the Spartan phalanx on open ground. and for a second, the universe stood still. Then they collided. The sound was not of swords. It was a dull thunder, the clash of thousands of bronze shields against wicker shields, and wicker shields shattered into splinters. It was a tragic joke. The Persians, brave and proud, were armed for a different war. Their light shields, designed to stop arrows, shattered. Their quilted linen armor was useless. The Spartan spears were longer, almost 3 meters. The Persians could not even touch a Spartan before their bodies were impaled not once, but 2 or 3 times with the rear ranks thrusting through the gaps. This was not a battle. It instantly became a meat grinder. The first Persian rank was impaled on spears. The second, stumbling over the corpses of the first, was impaled on spears. Mardonius's vast numerical superiority, his greatest advantage, became his worst nightmare. The men behind, unable to see the horror, pushed their comrades into the Spartan grinder. The Spartans did not scream. There was no wasted fury, only the rhythmic work of death, the shove of a shield, the brace of a foot, the thrust of a spear, the return of the spear. Repeat. Mardonius, from his white warhorse, watched his arrogance evaporate, replaced by a chilling horror. He had seen these men run, ordered them destroyed, and now they were erasing his immortal guard from the face of the earth. He knew the battle had come down to this precise moment. If this bronze line moved forward, his entire demoralized army, leaderless, would collapse. He had to break these ranks. He had to do it himself. He turned to his personal guard, 1,000 of the finest horsemen and noblemen of the empire. "With me," he yelled for the king. He drew his scimitar and spurred his horse, not to the flank, not to the rear. He attacked straight into the center of the Spartan line. He who had burned Athens, desecrated Greece, now led a suicidal charge straight into the heart of the beast. Thousands of noble horsemen crashed into the Spartan ranks with apocalyptic power. They smashed into the shield wall. Armored war horses, desperate brave warriors. For a moment, the Spartan formation buckled. Spears broke. Men fell, crushed by hooves. Mardonius raged in the epicenter of the fray. He towered over the infantry. His horse whinnied, and his scimitar flashed, cutting down enemies, shattering helmets, severing limbs. He roared, searching for the unfortunate Pausanias, believing that by killing the king, he would win the war. And then, a Spartan named Nianestes, a man almost forgotten by history, saw the giant on the white horse. His spear was too short. He was being pushed back. He noticed Mardonius raise his sword to kill another comrade. Ramnestis did not hesitate. He acted. He plunged into the infernal chaos and with both hands, grabbed what had defined this land for a year. A stone. With all his might, he hurled the stone. The stone flew through the air, a simple stone against a god of war, and struck Mardonius squarely in the head. Historians will say, the neck or the eye. But the result was the same. The Persian commander reeled. The sword slipped from his hand. He sat motionless in his saddle for a second, staring into the void. And then the conqueror of Athens slumped from his horse, a sack falling into the bloody mud of Plataea. For a second, silence fell around the body. And then the entire Persian army saw it. Their leader, their commander, their will, lay dead on the ground. The revenge of Leonidas was not complete. It had simply found its target. Panic has a sound. It is a collective suppressed scream, a whisper that turns into a roar. For the Persian army, it was the sound of 300,000 hearts breaking simultaneously. The man in the mud was not just a commander. He was the representative of the King of Kings, the will of the empire, and he was dead. The immortals, Mardonius's personal guard, fighting with suicidal fury against the phalanxes, stopped. They saw the riderless white horse. They saw the crushed body. And for the first time in their lives, they felt fear. One turned, then 2, then 100. In less than 30 seconds, the most formidable fighting force of the Persian Empire broke formation. They turned and ran, and that single act of panic became the death sentence for the entire army. The wave of 300,000 men, so arrogantly advancing, was now retreating. But as in a stampede, men trampled men. The infantry was trampled by its own terrified cavalry. The Persian army collapsed upon itself. Pausanias's face, covered in blood and dust, watched the chaos. The enemy line had evaporated. The Spartans saw it too, and the iron discipline that had held them in formation, the same discipline that had made them await the gods' permission while dying, now turned to a new purpose. No longer defense, but extermination. Plataea was the only order. The shield wall disintegrated, and the 10,000 Spartans, the apex predators of the ancient world, were unleashed. They discarded their heavy phalanx spears, drew their short swords, designed not for duels, but for thrusting in a melee. And the hunt began. For a year, they had carried Thermopylae as a brand of shame. Leonidas's sacrifice had been in vain, as Athens burned. Now, it was time for reckoning. Every Spartan ran, and with every stride, they screamed the name of their dead king, Leonidas. Leonidas. The plain of Plataea became an open slaughterhouse. The Persians, lightly armored, were fast, but panic made them foolish. The methodical Spartans did not chase the fastest. They cut down the slow, the stumbling. They aimed for hamstrings, for backs. It was dirty, efficient work. The Oenophyta River, which they had so confidently crossed that morning, became a deadly barrier. Thousands drowned, pushed into the water, by the press from behind, only to be speared in the back by the pursuing Spartans. The river, for the second time in a year, ran red with Persian blood. But most of the terrified army did not flee to the mountains. They ran to the only place they considered safe. Their camp, the massive wooden fortress built by Mardonius. They reached the gates. A mad human mass pushed and shoved each other to get inside. The Persian archers on the wooden watchtowers fired arrows, not at the approaching Spartans, but at their own men, to clear space at the gates. Finally, they closed the massive wooden gates. Silence fell. Inside the fortress, 100,000, perhaps 200,000 surviving Persians panted in terror. But they were alive. They were safe. And then, through the silence, they heard footsteps. The Greek army had reached the wooden walls. Pausanias halted his men. They were hoplites, the best heavy infantry in the world, but not engineers for assault. Their spears and short swords were useless against walls several meters high. The Spartans, in desperation, began to bash at the wood with their swords. The Persians on the battlements began to shoot arrows again, now confident, protected by their defenses. The revenge had stopped at the wooden wall. The battle had been won by the Spartans. However, the Persian army survived. They were trapped. Suddenly, to Pausanias' left, jubilant shouts erupted. It was the Athenians. They had spent the morning in their own bloody fight against the traitorous Thebans. Now, covered in the blood of Greeks and Persians, they had reached the fortress. And the Athenians, unlike the Spartans, were not just warriors. They were sailors, builders, the most skilled engineers in Greece. One Athenian commander glanced at the wooden wall, saw the Spartans uselessly battering it, and smirked. He turned to his fighters. "Bring the axes." The last gates of hell were about to open. The sound of axes is different from the clash of swords. It is more personal, more methodical. The Persians on the battlements heard again the dull thud of wood on wood. Again and again. It was the Athenians, and they realized their time was up. This was not a gate. It was their grave, and the Greeks were chopping it open. The Persian archers fired desperately from above. Men fell with arrows in their necks, eyes. But for every Athenian that fell, another picked up his axe and continued to chop. The wood groaned, the hinges creaked, the Spartans waited. They stood in tight formation behind the Athenians in a silence more chilling than any war cry. Their short swords, still dripping blood, were drawn. Their gazes were fixed on the cracking gates. There was no rage on their faces, only a terrifying focus. They were death surgeons, awaiting the opening of the operating room. With a crack that seemed to split the sky, the gates gave way. First a sliver, then a massive wooden beam splintered and fell inwards. For a second, complete silence reigned. Wood dust hung in the air. Inside the camp, the Greeks saw a sea of pale, terrified Persian faces, paralyzed with fear. Pausanias did not give an order. He simply raised his sword. The first Spartan to burst inside was Aramestus, the man who had killed Mardonius with a stone. He crossed the threshold, and his short sword found flesh, and then hell engulfed the Persian camp. The 10,000 Spartans surged through the breach not in phalanxes, but like a pack of wolves in a sheep pen. The camp was a labyrinth of taut wagons, terrified horses. There was nowhere to form up, nowhere to run. For the Persians, it was the worst nightmare. They found themselves nose to nose with the most efficient killers on the planet. It became thousands of individual duels. One Spartan against 3 Persians. One Spartan would stab a man, spin around to block another, slash the gut of a third, and all in under 3 seconds. The Persians resisted. They fought with the desperation of cornered rats. They used daggers, stools, tent poles. But the Spartans were on another level of violence. Their round shields were weapons. They smashed faces with them. Their short swords were pistons, designed to thrust upwards under the ribs, into the groin, under the armpits. Blood did not flow. It coated the camp floor so quickly that men slipped in it. The screams were deafening. The Athenians entered immediately behind the Spartans. If the Spartans killed with chilling efficiency, the Athenians killed with burning hatred. This was their revenge. For the desecrated temples, for their ravaged city. They hunted the Persians in their own tents, slashing through the canvas, toppling poles onto them, and then plunging daggers through the fabric as they writhed on the ground. The camp turned into a mile-wide abattoir. Pausanias stood by the broken gates, watching his men's tide consume everything in its path. He was no longer a commander. He was a witness. He saw one group of Persians, perhaps 40,000 men, manage to break through a section of wall on the far side of the camp. They fled north, led by a commander named Artabas, who had kept his men out of the initial battle. Sensing the disaster, Pausanias let him go. They were insignificant. The head of the snake had been severed. The body was being dismembered. The sun began to set. Dawn had brought a desperate retreat. Noon had seen the greatest battle in Greek history, and sunset now marked the end of Xerxes' army. The historian Herodotus would later say that of the 300,000 men Mardonius commanded, only 40,000, who fled with Artabazus, and barely 3,000 others survived that day. Hundreds of thousands annihilated. As darkness fell, the screams finally ceased. The silence that enveloped Plataea was heavier than steel. The Spartans emerged from the camp. They no longer resembled the warriors who had entered it. They were covered from head to toe in a crimson-black layer of blood and mud. Their arms were tired from killing. They walked silently towards their general's tent. Pausanias, the regent who had hesitated, the man who had almost lost the war through indecision, now stood at the center of the most absolute victory Greece had ever known. And then he ordered the final revenge to be enacted. "Find Mardonius's body," he said. His voice was calm, almost empty. They found him where he had fallen on the plain. They stripped him of his lamellar armor, his jewel-encrusted scimitar. A counselor approached Pausanias. "My lord," he said, "now we must complete the vengeance. Just as Xerxes beheaded our king Leonidas at Thermopylae and placed his head on a stake, so too must we do with Mardonius. This was justice, an eye for an eye. This was what everyone expected." Pausanias looked at the mangled corpse of the Persian commander. Then he looked at his warriors, 10,000 survivors who had avenged their 300 brothers. "No," Pausanias said. His answer stunned everyone. "This," he said, pointing to the disfigured corpse, "is behavior worthy of barbarians, not Spartans." Mardonius was buried with all the military honors befitting a brave commander, albeit an enemy. The revenge was not in a body on a stake. The revenge was in the silence of the Persian camp. The revenge was the Red River. The revenge had been earned. And on that day, Greece was forever free. When news of Plataea reached Ionia across the Aegean Sea, the Greek cities, subjugated by Persia, rose in revolt. Xerxes' empire had not just lost an army. It had lost its eagle of invincibility. It had all begun with 300 men who chose to die in a mountain pass. But it didn't end there. It ended here, on a muddy plain, when 10,000 bloody Spartans finally decided that the best revenge was not barbarity, it was total victory.